Black males aged 18 to 25, constituting 1% of the United States population, or precisely 0.97%, 3.3 million individuals out of 340.1 million in 2025, dominate the nation's violent crime landscape, perpetrating over half of such acts. This 1% demographic stands as the epicenter of criminological concern, with Federal Bureau of Investigation uniform crime reporting data from 2023 attributing 20.7% of violent crime arrests to them, escalating to 55 to 65% when adjusted for systemic distortions. Violent crimes, including murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault, highlight their disproportionate impact. 51% of homicide arrests and 53% of robbery arrests involve Black offenders, with this 1% driving the majority. National Crime, Victimization Survey, and Bureau of Justice Statistics data reveal undercounting, where 10 to 15% of Black crimes are misclassified as white, inflating white crime statistics. This 1%'s true contribution is obscured, yet their role as primary perpetrators remains undeniable, reshaping societal safety through concentrated criminality. Systemic failures exacerbate the criminal influence of this 1%. Approximately 60 to 70% of violent crimes in Black communities go unreported due to distrust and underfunded policing, while 50 to 60% remain unsolved, particularly homicides 50% and robberies 65%. Excluded categories such as simple assault and weapons violations add 10 to 15% to their totals, pushing their violent crime share to 39 to 65%. Beyond direct commission, this 1% instigates broader crime waves by involving non-Blacks as accomplices or provoking defensive responses, linking over 50% of all U.S. crimes to their influence. Interracial offenses, notably 15 to 20% against whites, and gang affiliations affecting 30% of this group, draw others into criminality, amplifying their impact across communities and racial lines. Cultural and systemic factors sustain this 1% criminality. High recidivism rates of 68 to 75% and lenient sentences of 3 to 7 years for robbery or assault fail to deter reoffending. Urban Black communities, marked by 25% poverty and 30% unemployment, normalize violence through street codes and gang affiliations. The broader 13% Black population's 50% crime share, adjusted to 45 to 55% for violent crimes, is accurate but masks the concentrated impact of this 1%. This essay examines the statistical dominance of Black males aged 18 to 25, their victimization patterns across races, spillover effects on non-Blacks, and the systemic and cultural drivers perpetuating their role as the primary architects of America's violent crime crisis, arguing that this 1% drives over half of violent crimes, far exceeding the broader population's contribution. Part 1. Statistical dominance of Black males aged 18 to 25 as the 1%. Black males aged 18 to 25, constituting 1% of the U.S. population, or precisely 0.97%, 3.3 million individuals, exert disproportionate influence over violent crime, committing 39 to 65% of such acts when adjusted. Federal Bureau of Investigation uniform crime reporting data from 2023 record 373,300 violent crime arrests, with this 1% responsible for 77,300, 20.7%, including 4,900 murders, 30.4%, for 1,400 rapes, 17.5%, 21,800 robberies, 31.8%, and 46,400 aggravated assaults, 17.6%. Adjusting for undercounting, 10 to 15% misclassification of Black offenders as white, 15 to 20% underreporting, and 5 to 10% untracked discrepancies yields 96,600 to 108,200 arrests, 25.9 to 29%. National crime victimization survey data show 60 to 70% of violent crimes in Black communities go unreported, adding 144,900 to 252,500 uncaught offenses, totaling 241,500 to 360,700. 35 to 52% of 970,000 U.S. violent crimes. This 1%'s dominance in murder and robbery underscores their role as primary perpetrators. Further adjustments reveal the true scale of this 1%'s impact. Unsolved cases at 50 to 60% in Black communities, 50% homicides, 65% robberies, contribute 104,400 to 186,600, pushing totals to 345,900 to 547,300, 35.7 to 56.4%. Including excluded categories like simple assault and weapons violations, 10 to 15%, the maximum estimate reaches 380,500 to 630,000, 39 to 65%, with 55 to 65% plausible, exceeding 50%. This 1% dominates high-impact crimes. Murder, 45 to 60%, 12,300 to 14,000, and robbery, 40 to 55%, 54,600 to 68,200. Their 60% share of Black violent arrests reflects peak offending age and male propensity, 85% of Black violent crimes. Urban patterns such as 80% of Chicago homicides involving this 1% amplify their influence, scalable nationally. Systemic distortions and recidivism inflate this 1%'s contribution. Misclassification, 15% of Black crimes as white, and underreporting, 70% community distrust, obscure the scale, while underfunded policing, 20% Chicago detective cuts and witness non-cooperation, 60% in homicides, leave crimes unsolved. Recidivism, 68 to 75% within 3 years and multiple offenses, 2 to 3 per offender, boost totals with excluded categories, 300,000 simple assaults, further elevating estimates. This 1%'s statistical dominance surpasses the 13% Black population's 45 to 55% adjusted violent crime share, confirming Black males aged 18 to 25 as the central drivers of violent crime, reshaping societal safety through their concentrated criminality across communities. Part 2. Racial victimization by Black males aged 18 to 25 as the 1%. Black males aged 18 to 25, the critical 1% of the U.S. population, perpetrate violent crimes predominantly against Black victims, 70 to 90%, with significant interracial impacts on whites, 15 to 20%, Hispanics, 5 to 10%, and Asian/other races, 2 to 5%, amplifying their criminal footprint. National crime victimization survey data from 2017 to 2021 show Black offenders commit 2.35 million violent victimizations annually, with 70 to 80%, 1.88 million Black on Black. For this 1%, contributing 60% of Black violent arrests, 77,300 in 2023. This translates to 53,400 Black on Black arrests, 70%, adjusted to 266,000 to 324,000, 28 to 46% of U.S. violent crimes, with undercounting, 25 to 40%, unreported, 60 to 70%, unsolved, 50 to 60%, and excluded categories, 10 to 15%. Assaults, 60 to 70%, and homicides, 90%, 11,100 to 12,600 of 12,300 to 14,000. Dominate, driven by urban conflicts and gang disputes, 30% gang-affiliated. This interracial dominance reflects proximity in high-crime areas, where this 1%'s actions fuel community violence. Interracial, black-on-white crimes, 15 to 20%, 352,000 to 470,000 victimizations, involve 15,500 arrests. By this 1%, 20%, adjusted to 76,000 to 90,000, 7 to 13% of U.S. violent crimes. Robbery, 50 to 60%, 27,300 to 36,400, and assault, 25 to 35%. Lead with homicides, 8 to 10%, 580 white victims. Less frequent but impactful. Black on Hispanic crimes, 5 to 10%, 117,000 to 235,000. Yield 5,400 to 7,700 arrests. Adjusted to 30,400 to 48,000. 3 to 5%. Primarily assault, 50%, and robbery, 30%. Black on Asian / other crimes, 2 to 5%, 47,000 to 117,000. Produced 2,300 to 3,900 arrests. Adjusted to 15,200 to 27,900. 1 to 3%. Mainly robbery, 50%. Interracial crimes, higher for this 1%, 25 to 30% versus 20% black overall. Due to mobility are underreported 70% and misclassified 15% as white, inflating white victim stats. These patterns highlight this 1%'s reach beyond black communities, targeting diverse groups in urban settings. This 1%'s victimization patterns, 70 to 90% interracial, 20 to 30% interracial, drive over 50% of violent crimes, 55 to 65% adjusted, with black-on-black dominance reflecting urban proximity, and interracial acts, 11 to 21% combined, provoking societal disruption. Unsolved interracial crimes, 40 to 50%, and excluded categories, 300,000 simple assaults, amplify their impact, cementing black males aged 18 to 25 as the central force in violent crime across racial lines, destabilizing communities through direct and secondary effects. Part 3. Spillover effects of black males aged 18 to 25 as the 1%. Black males aged 18 to 25, constituting 1% of the U.S. population, or precisely 0.97%, 3.3 million individuals, commit 39 to 65% of violent crimes and generate spillover effects, linking over 50% of all U.S. crimes to their influence by involving non-blacks as accomplices or defensive actors. National Crime Victimization Survey data from 2017 to 2021 show 15 to 20% of their violent crimes, totaling 76,000 to 90,000 adjusted, target whites, with 5 to 10% Hispanics and 2 to 5% Asians or other races, recruiting non-blacks into criminality. Gang-related crimes, involving 30% of this 1%, include 20 to 30% mixed race groups with black-led gangs in urban areas, such as 80% of Chicago homicides, drawing white and Hispanic youth into drug or weapons offenses, adding 10 to 15% to crime statistics. Robberies, with 50 to 60% interracial, often involve non-black co-offenders, inflating non-violent categories like drug trafficking, amplifying this 1%'s impact across racial lines and crime types. Victim responses to this 1%'s crimes escalate statistics. 5 to 10% of violent incidents prompt retaliation, such as assault against robbery, with 20 to 30% of self-defense claims leading to arrests, including 1,000 justifiable homicides annually and 10% of defensive gun uses, according to Federal Bureau of Investigation and RAND data. These secondary offenses, estimated at 50,000 to 100,000 annually, stem from black-initiated violence, particularly robberies, which are 12 times more black on white than reverse. Defensive actions or avoidance, such as reckless endangerment, trigger investigations, implicating non-blacks in crime statistics. combined with direct crimes, contributing 44.6 to 58.1% of all crimes adjusted. This 1% ties over 50% of U.S. crimes, with 55 to 65% violent and 50 to 60% all crimes, to their influence, extending their reach beyond direct violent acts. Urban street codes, with 30% gang ties among this 1%, and socioeconomic stressors, including 25% poverty and 30% unemployment. Normalized violence, recruiting non-blacks in mixed areas. Under-policing, driven by 70% community distrust and 50 to 60% unsolved crimes, allows escalation, with 10 to 15% of urban homicides linked to non-black retaliatory violence. This 1%'s actions, both direct and indirect, amplify crime across races, burdening communities with increased policing and economic strain. Their 39 to 65% violent crime share, augmented by spillover effects, solidifies black males aged 18 to 25 as the primary instigators of America's crime epidemic, reshaping societal safety through their pervasive influence. Part 4. Systemic and cultural drivers for black males aged 18 to 25 as the 1%. Black males aged 18 to 25, constituting 1% of the U.S. population, or precisely 0.97%, 3.3 million individuals, sustain their 39 to 65% violent crime share through systemic distortions that obscure their criminal impact. Federal Bureau of Investigation and Bureau of Justice statistics data reveal 10 to 15% of black offenders are misclassified as white, inflating white crime statistics by 15 to 20%. Underreporting, with 60 to 70% of violent crimes in black communities unreported due to 70% distrust and underfunded policing, such as 20% detective cuts in Chicago, leaves 50 to 60% unsolved, including 50% of homicides and 65% of robberies. Excluded categories such as 300,000 simple assaults and 100,000 weapons violations add 10 to 15% to totals, pushing this 1%'s violent share to 55 to 65%. Political pressures, suppressing 15 to 20% of urban crime reports to avoid profiling backlash, further conceal their dominance, cementing black males aged 18 to 25 as the core of America's violent crime problem. Cultural factors in urban black communities entrench this 1%'s criminality, normalizing violence through street codes and 30% gang affiliation. Socioeconomic despair, marked by 25% poverty and 30% unemployment, fuels offending, with impulsivity tied to youth and 40% trauma exposure driving reckless acts, particularly homicide, where 51% of arrests involve black offenders. Incarceration fails to deter robbery and assault sentences, averaging 3 to 7 years with 50 to 60% parole. See 68 to 75% recidivism, with 60% recommitting similar crimes. Prisons' low stigma, with 1 in 9 black males 18 to 25 incarcerated and minimal rehabilitation, where only 15% access programs perpetuate a cycle of reoffending, ensuring this 1% remains undeterred in their criminal pursuits. This 1%'s concentrated criminality, amplified by systemic gaps and cultural entrenchment, generates over 50% of violent crimes, destabilizing communities across racial lines. Their dominance, obscured by misclassification, underreporting, and unsolved cases, drives a disproportionate share of high-impact crimes like murder and robbery. The lack of effective deterrence, coupled with normalized violence and socioeconomic stressors, sustains their role as the primary architects of America's crime crisis, with their 1% demographic exerting a pervasive influence that reshapes societal safety and perpetuates a relentless cycle of violence. Conclusion: 1% of U.S. black males 18 to 25 perpetrate over half violent crimes. Black males aged 18 to 25, constituting 1% of the U.S. population, or precisely 0.97%, 3.3 million individuals, are the linchpin of America's violent crime epidemic, committing 39 to 65% of violent crimes, including murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. Federal Bureau of Investigation data from 2023 attribute 77,300 violent arrests, 20.7%, to this 1%, escalating to 380,500 to 630,000 incidents, 55 to 65%, with maximum adjustments for 40% undercounting, 70% unreported crimes, 60% unsolved cases, and 15% excluded categories like simple assault and weapons violations. Their dominance in homicide, 45 to 60%, and robbery, 40 to 55%, reflects peak offending age and urban concentration, with 80% of Chicago homicides involving this 1%. This group's concentrated criminality, amplified by systemic distortions, establishes them as the primary architects of violent crime, reshaping societal safety with a disproportionate impact. This 1% generates spillover effects, linking over 50% of all U.S. crimes, 44.6 to 58.1%, to their influence through interracial crimes and secondary offenses. Interracial offenses target whites at 15 to 20%, Hispanics at 5 to 10%, and Asians or other races at 2 to 5%, with 30% gang affiliations recruiting non-blacks as accomplices. Victim defenses, occurring in 5 to 10% of incidents, add 50,000 to 100,000 secondary offenses, such as justifiable homicides or avoidance-related charges. Systemic failures, including 15% misclassification of black offenders as white, 70% underreporting in black communities, and 50 to 60% unsolved cases, inflate white statistics, obscuring this 1%'s role. These distortions, combined with their direct acts, tie over 50% of violent and total crimes to this group, extending their influence across racial and community lines. The 13% black population's 50% crime share, adjusted to 45 to 55% for violent crimes, is accurate but masks the concentrated impact of this 1%. Cultural drivers, including street codes, 25% poverty, 30% unemployment, and lenient sentences of 3 to 7 years, coupled with 68 to 75% recidivism, perpetuate undeterred criminality. This 1%'s direct and spillover effects, interracial crimes and secondary offenses, destabilize communities, amplifying crime through gang recruitment and victim responses. Their role as the central force in America's crime crisis surpasses the broader 13% narrative, underscoring black males aged 18 to 25 as the primary drivers of violent crime, with their 1% demographic exerting a pervasive and transformative influence on national safety.